A few months back, I had an unsettling experience involving my young son, and it's the way it ended that still bothers me. I apologize for going into so much detail, but I feel it's important to give a full and clear picture of that day. To provide some context, my husband and I are both in our mid-20s, and we have 2 children. Lee, a boy, and Lynn, our 6-year-old girl. The differences between the two have been fascinating to see. Lynn is becoming more independent, while Lee is still very attached to me. He spent most of his early years during the lockdowns, which brought about its own challenges that we're working on now. Lee started learning to walk around the time the lockdowns began, and he was desperate to get outside and explore. It was hard seeing him so eager to do something he was essentially kept from doing, and it was difficult explaining it to someone so young. That's why I was so relieved when things finally started to open up. My husband and I had a lot to catch up on, and it was a year before we could finally take some time off as a family. In early June, we decided to spend a weekend away. Lee would finally be able to explore the world like he'd been wanting to. We packed up the car and drove out to a local nature preserve. It spans 50 square miles of forests and hiking trails, and it was a perfect day, sunny with clear skies. Lee was clearly thrilled, and I hoped a few hours of running around in the woods would give him the exercise he needed. We followed the marked trails, with my husband leading the way. Along the way, Lynn tripped and scraped her knee. It wasn't a big deal, but she handled it well, and I was proud to see her being so tough. While I was tending to her, Lee wandered off into the woods without us realizing. Took a couple of minutes before we noticed, and I didn't handle it well. Panic set in as visions of dangerous animals filled my mind, even though there weren't any bears around. My husband, calm as ever, suggested we start searching, reminding me that Lee, being only 4, couldn't have gotten very far. I took Lynn with me and retraced our steps down the trail, while my husband, who was more familiar with the woods, searched the area. The longer the search went on, the more frantic I became. Lynn started crying because she was scared, and that snapped me back to reality. I took a deep breath and reassured her that everything would be fine. It was as much to calm myself as it was to comfort her. Just then, I heard someone call out from the trail. I looked up and saw a woman standing with Lee holding his hand. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I ran to him, tears streaming down my face. He had a big grin on his face, clearly unaware of how serious the situation had been. I wiped my eyes and reached for him. He jogged toward me with his little legs, and I hugged him tightly, probably too tightly. I thanked the woman and asked where she had found him. She explained that she had been walking up the trail and had noticed him alone coming out of the woods. When he saw her, he walked right up to her, and all she had to do was extend her hand, and he took it. She said he seemed very comfortable with her, which put me at ease, but also left me confused. Once we got home, though, her words began to bother me, and that's where my problem lies. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm incredibly grateful for her help. I would give anything to get one of my children back if something were to happen to them. But what troubles me is how easily she was able to get Lee to walk off with her. It's unsettling to think how an ill-intentioned person could use that same approach. I can't help but wonder how many times something like that could have happened, and it's been eating at me ever since. I've tried to let it go, but the worry keeps coming back. I wish I could sit down and explain the risks to him, but he's at an age where I'm not sure he'd understand the full scope of it. I don't want to scare him or make him afraid of people, but I do worry that if I'm too direct, it could make him anxious and hinder his ability to form friendships as he grows up. Times are tough for kids these days, and I don't want to make it harder for him. So here I am, my mind going in a million directions, and I'm open to any advice. The ball is in your court. What do you think I should do? My involvement in this story began when I was 10. It was my first time hunting deer with my father and uncle. When my uncle spotted a set of tracks, I became fascinated. He noticed my interest and encouraged it, as he was a skilled tracker and he shared his knowledge with me. I supplemented his lessons with books. Over time, nature became my refuge and the wildlife my family. My desire to hunt lessened, and I used the skills I had learned to guide those who hadn't developed them. I don't oppose hunting. It's a natural part of life, and let's not forget, we're part of that cycle. After finishing school, I set out on my own to explore things beyond what was written in books or known to most. My work as a guide kept me fed, but it was my quest for knowledge that truly fulfilled me. Eventually, I became restless with that line of work and sought a new challenge. A position with a search and rescue team opened up and I applied. I was hired right away. Our team was near a national park, a state park, and vast public lands, and although I was a fairly experienced tracker by then, I didn't start out exclusively tracking people. It was a bit like tracking animals, but it had its own difficulties that I had yet to perfect. You never really do. My job was to follow our team leader and absorb everything he taught me. He was calm and patient, and I learned a lot from him. I took part in many operations before I finally had the chance to lead a team. It wouldn't be with my group, though, because a neighboring state had an urgent need for help, and I was tasked with leading a team to locate a missing hiker. He had been missing for nearly a week, and the weather was expected to worsen. I arrived the next day and got to work immediately. The situation was far from ideal. The hiker had a 4-day head start, and the area had already been disturbed by many people. We spent most of the morning looking for fresh tracks. Just before lunch, I found some and began the search. Everything about the trail seemed to match the description I had been given: boot size, weight. But as we got closer to the objective, I began noticing small inconsistencies. I tried to chalk them up to fatigue and kept going. By late afternoon, I spotted a small tent atop a hill. I radioed in, announcing that we had found the missing hiker. A wave of satisfaction washed over me, but it didn't last long. When we called out to the tent, a well-groomed young man stepped out, looking far too fresh. My team reassured him, telling him he was safe, but he looked confused. "What do you mean? I just got here this morning. Did someone report me missing?" he asked. That was when I understood why nothing had added up. I asked him his name, and it didn't match what was on my paperwork. To be sure, I looked around at his belongings, and although some things were similar, there were noticeable differences. A more experienced tracker should have caught those. The satisfaction I had felt vanished, replaced by shame. I couldn't look my team in the eye. I called in to admit my mistake, and I could hear the displeasure in our leader's voice. "So, what you're telling me is that the real missing person is still out there for another night?" he asked. I felt a wave of fear and guilt. Because of my error, this man would have to spend another night alone in the woods, and with a snowstorm on the way, his chances of surviving were slim. I couldn't face my team after that. I wanted to quit and walk away, but a life was at stake. I sent my team back to camp and stayed behind to search on my own. The next morning, I was back on the trail. My mistake was clearer now, as was my arrogance. I had ignored where one trail split, and I hadn't followed the signs. The lost hiker had been on the same path just the day before, but had veered off in another direction. I had ignored my instincts, too eager and too confident. By late morning, I could tell the hiker was in serious trouble. The dragging steps he had left behind said it all. When I finally reached the end of the trail, it was worse than I feared. The man was crawling on all fours, weak and delirious. Up ahead, I saw a mound of bright clothing. It had to be him. I rushed up to check his condition, but when I touched him, his skin was cold. I immediately radioed for my team, and within minutes, they arrived. We all knew he was gone, but the paramedics tried to revive him anyway. I could only sit there, my hands over my face. This was my first time leading a team, and because of my arrogance, a man was dead. I thought about quitting, leaving for good, because no one would ever trust me again. I felt like I had let everyone down, especially my mentor. I considered calling him to apologize, but I figured he'd hang up on me. Why would he want to hear from me after such a failure? So I was stunned when he called me. He asked why I hadn't contacted anyone, and I was confused. Haven't you heard? I messed up badly. A man's dead because of it, I said. Tell Mark I'm not coming back. I'm a liability. His response shocked me. He sighed and said, so what if you made a mistake? We all screw up. I messed up just yesterday. You're not the first and you won't be the last. We all make mistakes. You know we depend on each other. Are you really willing to walk away from this knowing what we stand for? Get it together and come back to work. If you want to quit, you can tell Mark in person. I expected more from you. I was speechless. No one had criticized me like that. I had been punishing myself, but maybe I was just overreacting. I managed to mumble an okay and hung up. I felt like a child being scolded by a parent. I did as he said and showed up at the station the next day. Everyone was there for a training session. Mark noticed me and asked if I was joining. I didn't sense any anger or distrust from him. Though hesitant, I sat down at one of the tables. The class continued like any other, and every day since then has been a valuable experience. Not once has anyone mentioned my mistake, not even my mentor. We never discussed that phone call. Maybe there was no need to. I still feel bad about not finding that man, but I know we did everything we could, and we wouldn't have been able to let him rest in peace without at least trying. Finding yourself alone in an unfamiliar place can be terrifying, especially for a child. Now imagine it's a vast forest, and you have no clue where you are. That's what happened to me when I was 8. Our family was on vacation in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I vividly remember how amazed I was by all the trees, being from a desert area where such greenery was rare. As an adult, I understand that forests are common, but they were a novelty for me back then. At the time, I was only 8 with limited life experiences. The mood of the trip had already felt off, even before I got lost. Although I didn't know it yet, my parents' separation was just a year away. I could sense that something was wrong. There was an underlying tension throughout the entire vacation. My brother, who was only 2 years older than me, was unusually quiet and well-behaved. Every time I tried to pick a fight with him, he ignored me. It made for a long, dull trip. I went a little wild when we reached Lake Placid, our second day there. We visited an amusement park called Mountain Springs, which was similar to places like Six Flags. I wore my parents out, begging to go on every ride, even the ones I wasn't tall enough for. I threw fits every time I was told no. Looking back, I was a real brat. The following day, we headed to a nearby campground where my parents had planned to stay for a few days. Camping was a completely new experience for me, and I couldn't understand why anyone would choose to do it. I spent the whole first day asking a million questions. I demanded answers immediately and couldn't wait to know everything. I'm sure it was exhausting for my parents. I later wondered if I was the reason their marriage fell apart. Was it my fault my dad left? At the time, I didn't care about anything but myself and my desires. Things took a turn the next day. Sleeping in a tent turned out to be the coolest thing in the world. It was a complete change of heart from the day before. Suddenly, I wanted to live this way forever. My dad had to practically drag me away from the campfire when it was time to go to bed. And little did I know, that moment would spark a future fascination. But at the time, I was just eager to explore the woods around me. After breakfast, the whole family went for a hike by the lake. Every few steps, I would stop to examine something new. I wasn't concerned about keeping up or anything else. My dad tried his best to keep me in line, but as any parent knows, kids have a knack for disappearing. That's exactly what happened to me. One time, I stopped to look at something, and before I knew it, I had wandered off the trail. I have no idea how long I walked, but at some point my stomach growled. I paused and called out for a snack. That's when I realized I was completely alone. I looked around, but every tree and fern looked the same. I figured I couldn't be far from the trail. I called out for my mom, then my dad, but no one answered. A sick feeling began to creep into my stomach. At first, I wasn't that scared, thinking they'd find me any minute. But I walked on, searching for something familiar. The hours passed, and as the sun began to set, my unease grew into full-blown panic. I ran from tree to tree, screaming for help. Just before dark, I spotted a trail in the distance. I saw a figure in the distance and screamed, hoping it was someone who could help. When the figure turned toward me and hurried toward me, I wondered if there was some kind of monster coming to get me. My instinct told me to run, but then I heard my dad's voice calling my name. Couldn't believe it. I dropped to the ground, crying with relief. He scooped me up, and I'll never forget how safe I felt in his arms. That moment was the best feeling I'd ever experienced, at least until my own daughter was born. We returned to the camp, and my mom hugged me until I could barely breathe. A bunch of uniformed people were standing around, and a paramedic even checked me over. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep in my parents' tent and didn't wake up until it was time to pack up the next morning. After my little adventure, my parents decided they'd had enough of relaxing. We packed everything into the car and headed home. 2 days later, we were back in Phoenix, and everything seemed right in the world again. I quickly forgot about the whole ordeal. As I mentioned, my parents divorced the following year, and that marked the end of our family vacations. I went camping with a few friends over the next few years, and by then I was old enough to understand things better. I'm 27 now, and though I've grown older, I still think about that day. Every time I find myself alone in an unfamiliar place, I'm reminded of what happened in that forest. Some things, no matter how small, stick with us forever. One summer, while I was living and working around the Chicago area, I experienced some very odd things. I'm no expert on ghosts or the paranormal, so I'll just share what happened, and you can decide for yourself. Soon after starting my new job, I met a great guy named Paul, and we hit it off. One day, he suggested we go hiking. Originally, I'm from Russia, so spending time in forests is nothing new to me, and I was excited. As we were hiking, it started to rain harder than I'd ever seen. We ventured further and further into the woods, eventually leaving any trails behind and wading through swampy areas. We were busy talking and getting to know each other, not paying much attention to where we were. We hadn't seen anyone for a while, given how deep we were and the heavy rain. Then we came across an old teepee frame, just the wooden structure. We thought it was interesting and kept going that way. Suddenly, we both heard a baby crying. In the forest, animals sometimes make sounds like that, so we figured it was a fawn or something. The cry seemed far off at first, so we ignored it. But within seconds, the sound was right next to us. It was so close and loud that it could have been a few feet away. But when we looked around, even up in the trees, we saw nothing. The situation felt strange, so we quickly walked in the other direction. As soon as we paused, the crying sound started up again, as if urging us to leave. We took off, nearly running back to the trailhead, relying on Google Maps and our memory to navigate. Once out, we agreed it was unsettling and started looking up information about the area. Websites on haunted forests in Illinois popped up, and it turned out the place was on Native American burial grounds. We put the whole incident out of our minds until one night after work, when Paul told me he couldn't stop thinking about it and wanted to return to the spot. I thought it was a bad idea, especially since it was dark out, but his friend Ryan wanted to join too, and I figured I'd tag along to keep an eye on them. We drove there, arriving around 11 p.m. after a missed turn. Once we got to the forest entrance, we headed in with flashlights, but visibility was poor. We crossed a small bridge leading to a deeper part of the woods. As soon as we crossed, I felt uneasy, like we were intruding on something. Ryan, who'd been confidently leading the way, suddenly stopped on the other side of the bridge, and we were all hit with a strong feeling of dread. I've spent time in forests, day and night, but I'd never felt anything like this. We exchanged nervous looks, and then heard something crunching toward us in the dark. Ryan, who had seemed unfazed a moment before, looked anxious and said, "Maybe we should head back." We all turned around and started walking briskly toward the bridge, only relaxing once we were on the other side. When we got back to the road where our car was parked, we noticed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, walking along the highway. She looked indigenous or possibly of Asian or Hispanic descent and was wearing very little clothing. Her walk seemed strange, like she was almost vibrating, though she wasn't stumbling like someone who'd been drinking. There wasn't a building in sight, which felt odd. My stepdad is Malaysian and has told me stories about spirits that appear on roadsides, but I didn't want to leave her alone, ghost or not. I convinced Paul to slow down and I called out, asking if she needed help. She turned slowly, a strange smile spreading across her face, and nodded. I felt that same unsettling feeling from the forest, but decided to help her anyway. She got in the back seat right behind me next to Ryan. Ryan started chatting with her, asking where she was from, but the whole time, she kept her gaze fixed on me, smiling slowly. It was eerie, and I felt uneasy, as if something bad would happen if I looked away. Ryan asked her if she'd come from a bar, and she nodded, though there were none nearby. She gave an address about 15 minutes away, and while we drove, her smile never faded, and I felt the dread building up. When we finally got to her street, I turned around to check one last time, and she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing her smiling face in the dark, almost as if it was waiting for me. Many of us have been there. You're on a trip, riding in the car with your boyfriend, and he does or says something that gets under your skin. Maybe he accidentally calls you by his ex's name. You lose it and demand he pull over right then and there. He tries to fix things, but you're not having it. Eventually, he pulls over, and you get out, starting to walk down the road. Do you have a destination in mind? Did you think about how cold it might be outside? No, he didn't. And now you're stuck on some unfamiliar road, freezing, while your pride won't let you turn back. In most cases, cooler heads would take over, and the mistake would be forgotten. But there are times when things don't go that way. These are the moments when bad things often happen. I'm going to share my own story of when things went wrong, hoping it shows how important it is to think before acting. This happened when I was 20. I was dating a guy who was a year older than me and went to the same college. He had his own apartment, and one evening, we were coming back from a movie when he made the unforgivable mistake of laughing at my makeup. I was devastated, just like in the earlier scenario. I snapped and demanded he pull over. I needed to be anywhere but in that car with him. He tried to calm me down, but that only made it worse. I started yelling again and demanded that he let me out. I even tried to jump out while the car was still moving. He saw this and finally pulled over, cursing under his breath. The car stopped, and I got out, leaving my sweater and jacket behind. After walking a few steps, I heard the car creeping up behind me. I ignored it and kept walking. He began calling my name and begging me to come back. The more desperate he sounded, the more I kept going. He eventually ran up and tried to grab me, but I was in full fight or flight mode and ran into the nearby woods. I thought he would follow me, but he didn't. The last thing I heard him shout was something like, "If you think I'm waiting all night for you to come out, you're wrong." Which, looking back, made a lot of sense. I heard his tires screech off in the distance and then complete silence. Now I was alone in the woods in the dark, with no flashlight and no idea where I was. I had run so far that I couldn't even hear the road anymore. The cold was really starting to set in, and that's when his little joke started to feel a lot more serious. It was well past midnight, and I was stranded in the woods with the temperature dropping fast. That's when I realized how bad my situation really was. I kept walking for about an hour when I heard the howl of coyotes in the distance. At the time, I thought they were wolves, not knowing anything about coyotes. I can laugh about it now, but back then I was terrified. Imagine being all alone, in the dark, with a pack of predators out there. I turned around and ran the other way, convinced they were chasing me. If they actually were, running away was the worst thing I could have done. I couldn't even count how many times tree branches scraped across my face and arms. Eventually, I had to stop because I was so exhausted. The howls were far behind now, but I was too tired to keep going. If I was going to die, I prayed it would be quick. Looking back, the coyotes probably didn't even know I was there. But that didn't help me at the time. The cold was unbearable, and I couldn't stop shaking. I thought about starting a fire, but realized I had no way to do that. I kept moving as best as I could, but soon my body started giving out. I was at the point where I thought I might die if I stopped, but I was too tired to care. I was just about to give up when I stumbled upon a gravel road. It was like a second wind hit me. I knew it had to lead to a main road, so I picked a direction and kept walking. After a while, I realized I was almost jogging. About half an hour into the walk, I thought I heard cars in the distance, and I broke into a run. When I turned a corner, I finally saw the highway. I kept following the road south until I reached a 24-hour gas station. I called a friend to come pick me up, and we stopped at a diner on the way home. It was there that I saw my first sunrise, and it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. After a long, restful sleep, I called my boyfriend and ended things. From his reaction, it was clear he was relieved. Our relationship had been filled with constant drama, and it was clear we weren't meant to be together. I was back on the market, but I didn't rush into a new relationship. Instead, I took some time to figure out what I really wanted from a partner. That brief night in the woods showed me how much I needed to mature. When I did start dating again, I made sure to avoid guys who acted immature. If both partners behave like children, the drama will never end. It seemed like the right approach because less than a year later, I met my husband by chance at a bookstore. He's the definition of chill, and his calm energy has rubbed off on me, especially when I look back on that night. And that's my story. I hope it helps someone think twice before acting on impulse. When I was young, around second grade, my family moved out to a secluded area in rural Mississippi. There were no other kids nearby, so I often felt quite lonely, which wasn't surprising. During the time we were getting settled, my parents had a large mobile home, and one experience during this period took years for me to fully process. One day, when we were visiting the plot where the mobile home would eventually sit, my mom needed to stop and use a restroom. With no gas station for at least 10 miles, my dad turned down a dirt road, hoping to find a private spot. Around 200 or 300 yards from the main road, we came across what looked like an abandoned gym, maybe from an old school. My dad decided this would be a place for my mom to go. We went inside, and while I don't remember much about the place, one detail sticks in my mind. Near the entrance was a huge mound of old clothes. After my dad finished his business, he paused in front of that pile, looking up at it thoughtfully, though he didn't say a word about it. Several weeks later, after the mobile home was set up, we moved in, and I pretty much forgot about the gym. But strange things started happening. They weren't strange in a way you'd expect, like objects moving on their own, but still odd. Within a month or so of living there, I was on the front porch playing with some toys when I heard children laughing. Now, to give some context, our mobile home was about 100 feet back from a dirt road, and across the road lived an elderly man I'll call Tom. Behind Tom's house was a large stretch of pine trees extending all the way to the two-lane highway, about 500 to 600 feet from where I was playing. As I sat on the porch, I kept hearing laughter. Not just one child, but what sounded like several kids, maybe 5 or 6, laughing and playing somewhere behind Tom's place. Since I didn't have friends nearby, I was curious and wondered if these kids would play with me. I walked up to the road, trying to figure out where they were, and it seemed like they were playing in the woods, with their laughter drifting on and off. After a bit, I called out that I wanted to play too, and as soon as I said it, the laughter stopped. 1 second there was cheerful noise, and then total silence, as if you could hear a pin drop. I figured I'd scared them off and went back inside. This happened several more times. I'd hear the kids laughing, but they never came closer. After it happened a few times, I mentioned it to my mom. She got an odd expression on her face and told me she didn't want me playing on the front porch anymore. We stayed in that house for about 2 more years before moving, and I mostly forgot about the experience. It wasn't until years later that the story came up in a conversation with my parents, which is when I learned more. My mom told me her reaction back then was because she'd heard rumors that the area was haunted. She didn't have all the details, but felt it was related to the old gym. All she could say was that something bad had happened there, and it made her uneasy. After both my parents passed away, the memory stuck with me as an unexplained, strange experience. Then one night, feeling nostalgic, I stumbled across a website for the church we'd attended back then. On a whim, I sent an email to the pastor, asking if he knew anything about a gym near where we'd lived. I didn't expect a reply, but a couple of months later, I checked my email and found a response. The pastor told me that, yes, there had once been a gym close to where I remembered. It was part of a private school that had operated there from around 1900 until the late 1970s. Early that spring, a tornado had hit, collapsing one wing of the school and tragically trapping a group of students beneath the debris. Between 10 and 15 children lost their lives in the disaster, and soon after, the school was permanently closed. They'd piled clothing from lockers and other belongings in the gym, which was the pile I remembered. They'd hoped to let a local church use the building, but given what had happened, it was abandoned. The land behind Tom's house had once been part of the school's property, used by students as a playground. That would explain why Tom sometimes dug up old toys, mostly metal trucks, which he'd give to me. Looking back, I now believe that what I'd been hearing was somehow connected to the old school and the tragedy that had occurred. Of course, it's possible that it was just my young imagination, but whatever the case, I thought you'd find the story interesting. My family has a cabin in British Columbia that my great-grandparents originally built, and it's where we spend part of our summers. Our family is big, so we always have to plan in advance who gets which weeks. About 9 years ago, my uncle had a new girlfriend, who later became my favorite aunt, Carrie. We decided to travel there together, and around 8 p.m. we finally arrived. The sun was setting, and there was a heavy feeling in the air. I figured we were all just worn out from the 9-hour drive. We started unloading bags and coolers from the cars and putting them on the front deck. Since Carrie was new to the family, she wanted to make a good impression, so she volunteered to bring everything inside on her own. She went in and stayed there for several minutes before returning with a strange expression. She approached Nana and mentioned something about seeing another relative in the cabin, even though she thought our group was supposed to be the only one staying there that week. Now, my grandpa has a troubled sister who sometimes stays in the cabin when it's empty. Nana immediately got annoyed and asked Grandpa, "For heaven's sake, Bill, is Sylvia here again?" But then Carrie said she didn't think it was Grandpa's sister unless she'd aged about 20 years. At that, Nana looked puzzled and decided to go inside to check. I tagged along behind her, curious as ever. She checked the upstairs, while I stayed on the main floor and bumped into my uncle, who had just finished using the bathroom. Carrie came back inside, and he mentioned that he'd heard her talking to someone and asked who it was. She replied, "Oh, I ran into a lady in that room over there." She pointed to the bedroom that used to belong to my great-grandmother before she passed. At this point, none of us had quite caught on to what was happening until Nana came back downstairs and said no one was there. I felt a chill, and I could see that Carrie and my uncle felt it too. We continued unpacking, and Carrie started carrying her things upstairs but stopped on the staircase, dropping her bags. My uncle asked if she was all right, and she could barely speak as she pointed to a picture on the wall. She said, "That's her. That's the lady I saw." The picture was of my great-grandparents, and there was a small plaque with their names on it. My uncle, ever the skeptic, responded, "Nice try, but no way. That's my grandmother, May. She passed away 6 years ago." Carrie looked at him, Nana, and me with a look of pure shock, and we all believed her. She swore she'd come in, dropped Nana's things in the room, and had seen an older woman by the window. She had apologized for entering and said it was nice to meet her, and the woman smiled before turning back to the window. Carrie even described what she wore: a green velvet sweater with beads arranged in an AZ design on the front, my great-grandmother's favorite sweater. We all felt chills and told the rest of the family what had happened. Even my grandpa, who's a skeptical, no-nonsense type, looked unnerved when he heard that Carrie might have seen his mother. Carrie isn't the only one in our family who has witnessed something unusual in that room. I had a similar experience one night. Everyone else was gathered around a fire outside, and I went in to grab marshmallows. To get to the kitchen from the back door, you have to pass that same bedroom. As I walked by, I distinctly heard a conversation coming from inside, though everyone was still outside. The closer I got to the door, the fainter the voices grew until they faded entirely. This was after what happened with Carrie, so I just poked my head around the corner and said, "Good night, Nana May." Then I grabbed the marshmallows and went back outside. I have a lot of stories about that cabin, many of them not as lighthearted as this encounter with my great-grandmother's spirit. Maybe I'll share more someday. I have plenty. I was on a week-long family vacation when I received a call from the police. An officer informed me that my father's car had been found abandoned on a remote back road at the edge of the county. I was in a panic, as anyone would be, so we cut our trip short and rushed home. I had to wait until I met with the police to learn the full details. A deputy had been on his regular patrol when he came across a car parked oddly at the side of the road, with the driver's side door wide open. Upon approaching, he noticed the engine was still running, but there was no sign of anyone in the car. As per procedure, the deputy ran the license plate, and it came back to my father. This started the missing persons investigation. When I arrived back, my father was still missing, and no one had reported seeing him. Despite the concern, I wasn't overly afraid. There was no indication he'd been harmed. The prevailing theory was that he might have wandered into the woods and got lost, though my father was an experienced woodsman and hunter. I had no doubt he'd show up when he was ready. During the search, my husband and I shared photos and details of my father's disappearance on social media. 3 days passed before a tip came in. A woman was hanging laundry when she saw an older man walking through the woods nearby. She described him as looking confused and disoriented. She ran inside to call the sheriff, but when she returned, he had vanished. Her information led a group of volunteers to find my father hitchhiking 5 miles away from where he had disappeared. We rushed to the location, and this was when I first knew something was wrong. Just as the woman had described, my father looked confused and unwell. He was also severely dehydrated and exhausted, which I assumed was the reason he was sent to the hospital. I stayed by his side that night. The next morning, he was feeling better, but something still wasn't right. I spoke to the doctor about my concerns, and he ordered some cognitive tests. That afternoon, my father was discharged, and we decided to keep him with us until the results came in, so we could better understand his condition. When the tests were done, the results were worse than I expected. The neurologist noted several signs of cognitive decline. My father struggled to answer simple questions that someone his age would normally have no trouble with. During his time staying with us, I saw the effects firsthand. His memory seemed to deteriorate throughout the day, something that could be partly due to fatigue, but there was a noticeable difference compared to just 6 months ago. It was hard to see someone once so sharp lose their edge. The last month has been especially tough for our family. Currently, my father is back at his own home. He no longer has access to his car, and I'm not sure if he misses it. My husband and I are conflicted about whether to place him in a care facility where he can get the help he needs as his condition worsens, or to bring him to live with us. I'm not trained to care for him, and I don't have the strength to assist him with daily tasks like personal hygiene. The thought of him being in a facility surrounded by strangers, slipping away from us, seems even harder to bear. In times like these, I'm reminded of how fortunate I am to have a supportive family. We haven't made any decisions yet, but time is running out, and we need to decide soon. I would appreciate any suggestions, and we'd be grateful for your prayers. Thank you for listening. There was no way to tell how long I'd been running. At least 10 minutes, no more than 20. Either way, it was further and faster than I'd ever run before. When you're running for your life, your body can push itself far beyond what you'd ever think possible. I shouldn't have stopped, but the pain in my legs was unbearable, and he could have been right behind me. He may not have gone more than 100 yards, but I wasn't ready to find out. I saw him, his gun. The clip must have held 40 to 50 bullets, and that had to be enough to turn me into dust. No one would ever recognize me, and maybe that's what he was counting on. I had no choice but to keep going. I could die at any moment, but if I could just find a road or a park employee, maybe I'd make it. I dared to stop for just a moment to catch my breath and kept going until nightfall. Only then did I feel safe enough to stop. The night was warm, and starting a fire would have been a bad idea anyway. But with nothing to wrap up in except the fleece in my pack, I zipped it up all the way and pulled the hood tightly over my head. A decaying log lay nearby with a large hollow space in the back, so I curled up there and fell asleep quickly. I woke once or twice but quickly drifted off again. By dawn, I continued my search. It was less of a search now. Unless my pursuer showed himself, I had to assume he had given up. The chill in my body soon faded with the exertion, and for now, water was plentiful. Hunger, however, was becoming a real enemy. I had never gone more than one night without eating, and it had been over 24 hours. Starving wasn't a death I wanted to face. It was a slow, miserable end, lacking any romanticism. Maybe the gun would have been a better option, I thought to myself, but neither of us would meet our end that day. As the sun climbed high above, I stumbled upon a road, the same road I had entered 3 days before, and soon my suffering ended. A group of men working on fire prevention found me, and they took me to the main ranger station. I recounted the entire ordeal, and that's when their official search began. To properly explain how I ended up there, I must start 3 days before. For most of my adult life, I lived near a famous national park in the US, but it had never appealed to me until I went through a rough breakup. I thought the isolation would give me the peace I needed. Late on a Friday afternoon, I arrived at the park. I set up camp before dusk and spent the evening relaxing with a beer by the fire. I used this time to plan my hike for the next day. The quiet was soothing, and sleep came easily, something I hadn't experienced in weeks. I didn't stir until 8 a.m., After a small breakfast of oatmeal, I packed a small bag for my hike. I was heading to a spot 5 miles ahead, situated above a pasture where wild animals often grazed. I planned to have a quick lunch and enjoy the views before heading back to camp before nightfall. The first part of the hike went well, but at some point, I took a wrong turn and got lost. I didn't realize it for a while, but once I did, panic set in. Hours passed, and I seemed to get deeper and deeper into the woods. Around 3 p.m., I heard voices in the distance, so I started running toward them. I tripped and fell over a hose of some sort, but I wasn't hurt. As I stood up and dusted myself off, a man walked up behind me. He spoke with a heavy accent, and I explained my situation and asked for help. Another man appeared, carrying an assault rifle, which made me nervous. He seemed nervous, too. The two men started talking, and it seemed like they were arguing about something. Neither of them took their eyes off me. Just then, a third man arrived, unarmed and seemed to be in charge. He spoke to both men in a gruff and confident manner. When he finished, he pointed at me. The man with the rifle said, "Okay," and frowned. All three of them stepped back a few paces. The armed man aimed the rifle at me and pulled something back. The handle slammed with great force, and even though I didn't know much about firearms, I had a good idea of what was coming. A sick feeling rose in my stomach. My heart pounded. I had to run, but I didn't know where. As he raised the gun to his shoulder, I took my chance and fled blindly. Branches and vines tore at my face and arms. Every second, I expected a bullet to hit me. A few zips and cracks sounded nearby, and within moments, my legs ached from the effort, my lungs burning as I fought for air. I wasn't sure how much more I could take, but I knew that stopping meant death. Going back meant death. My only options were death. The rest, The Rangers contacted several outside agencies to help with the search. Took 2 weeks before an FBI agent reached out. I answered his questions and asked if there was any news. He was vague, but from what I gathered, the men had escaped capture. He assured me there was no immediate danger to the public, as long as people stuck to marked trails. I will never return to that place. That's all I know. I have some theories, such as illegal marijuana farms, but I can't be sure. I feared the men would hunt me down at my home, but that concern turned out to be unfounded. PTSD is common for those who've been through such encounters, and I thought I'd experience it. Yet, it's been 17 years and I'm mostly the same. Thankfully, I feel fine. The experience, though harrowing, was a lesson. In hindsight, the problems I had at that time seemed trivial. In that sense, I guess my escape to the woods did serve its purpose. A strange event happened last year that has stuck with me ever since a coworker suggested I share it here, using an anonymous name, of course. I wasn't familiar with Reddit, so I did some research and found the subreddit. I think you'll enjoy it as it has all the eerie elements readers seem to love, and, best of all, unlike most stories here, this one is actually true. After high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. With few options, I joined the Navy, eventually becoming a corpsman attached to a Marine unit in Afghanistan. Once my time in the service ended, I went to school to earn my EMT certification and later my paramedic one. While in college, I met an incredible woman and we started dating. Not long after, we moved in together, and it seemed like I was on track to becoming a devoted father and husband, just like my father had been. But that wasn't meant to be. Time passed quickly, and after 3 years, nothing I had hoped for had happened. My relationship fell apart, leaving me heartbroken. Not the success story I had envisioned. While I worked, I could focus, but my free time was difficult. I needed a distraction. After thinking it over, I found a local volunteer search and rescue organization. I reached out to them and they were happy to have me. I dove in first. In many ways, it was similar to the military, going into the wilderness to help people in need. I liked it so much, I hoped to make it a full-time career when the chance came. I hadn't thought about my ex in months, but that's enough about me. Let's get to why I'm here. It's not uncommon for people to report encounters with individuals acting strangely. This can range from a confused hiker to something more concerning, as in this case. I was at home one day when I received a call from my supervisor. A sheriff's deputy had received a report from a woman who had been walking her dog on some public land. She had encountered a young man on the trail. At first, he seemed normal, but as they talked, he became more detached from reality. He claimed he was being chased by a group of men and had been running from them for over 100 miles. He seemed genuinely terrified. The woman noticed that he was wearing a backpack and expensive, clean outdoor gear. She didn't think he was homeless or intoxicated. Feeling sympathy for him, she tried to get him to come with her to the sheriff's office. But when she turned her back, he disappeared. She immediately reported it to the sheriff. The deputy knew we had the expertise for this kind of situation and hoped we could track him down before anything serious happened. The search didn't begin until the next morning, but we quickly picked up his trail. It didn't look like he had been struggling, and it didn't take long to catch up with him. Unfortunately, the outcome wasn't what I'd hoped for. He had ended his life sometime during the night. The trail led to a sheer drop of over 1,000 feet. We recovered his body, and the search was effectively over. I went back to the top to retrieve a few of his personal belongings that had been dropped. One of our trackers, who I'll call Jack, was kneeling a few yards away, staring intently at something and mumbling to himself. He saw me and called me over. He pointed to the ground and asked me what I saw. At first, nothing stood out to me, but after a moment, something caught my attention. The dried dirt in the area looked as though it had been swept with a broom or tree branch. I then noticed that the edge of a boot print was partially erased. Only the heel remained. Jack got up and walked over to a small tree with a broken stump. He pointed at it and I nodded, recognizing it. I searched for the freshly broken limb and soon found it. It had been carelessly tossed into the bushes. Jack then led me to the cliff's edge. We stood there and looked back at the trail. Now in the daylight, we could see the sweeping marks leading up to the edge, where the only tracks left belonged to our team. I hope I've made my point clear. If not, I'll be more direct. Someone had tried to hide their presence but had made a mistake. Did you catch it yet? Let me help a little. If a man had been traveling up the trail where his tracks had been visible for miles, why would they suddenly vanish 30 yards from the cliff's edge, the same cliff he supposedly jumped from? There was no other path to reach the edge. We checked every direction to be sure. We had a lot of questions but no answers. I looked at Jack and asked what this meant. His response wasn't very helpful. I'm not really sure, but I have a hard time believing that guy jumped all the way from there. We decided to keep this information to ourselves for the time being. We didn't want to upset his family with some wild theory. Even now, I can't say for certain what happened to that young man. If I hadn't noticed the partial heel print and the missing tracks, I wouldn't have thought twice. While I do have my theories, I'll keep them to myself for now. You'd probably think I was crazy. I'll let you all discuss your ideas. I'm curious to see what you come up with. But I warn you, if anyone starts talking about aliens or anything paranormal, we'll laugh it off. They say the most logical explanation is usually the correct one. So, what seems most logical to you?